I argue that this narrative gains much of its traction through the negative invocation of disability. That is, the welfare queen becomes legible as a rhetorical figure largely through ableist reasoning and language. She is defined necessarily as a pathological mother, a social aberrancy to be rehabilitated through workfare programs. Through her alleged inability to mother, work, or reproduce in accordance with social norms, articulated through a kind of clinical dependency on state resources, she furnishes a useful story for global capitalism to propagate itself through the dismantling of social safety nets. By bridging disability with feminist of color politics through the welfare mother, this talk thus extends the project of coalition through difference, so central to women of color feminist theory and praxis, highlighting generative nodes of affinity between two fields rarely in conversation. While both ethnic American and feminist of color studies have hesitated to adopt disability as an analytic, given the ways in which disability has been used historically to justify racial and gendered violence, so here dependency is one example, I argue for the utility of a disability analytic precisely because it enables us to consider social and aesthetic possibilities beyond the achievement of self-ownership, and for us to see dependency as a site of potential literary production as well as a site of political recuperation. In other words, what does power, liberation, and survival look like when able-bodiedness is no longer centered? The remainder of this presentation will sketch out my response to this question and will proceed in 3 parts. First, I will elaborate how discourses of disability have fundamentally shaped the figure of the welfare queen and imbued her with rhetorical power. Then, looking to Sapphire's 1996 novel Push and Jesmyn Ward's 2011 novel Salvage the Bones, novels that engage welfare reform's legacy through stories of Black teenage motherhood, I examine counter-narratives of mothering that emerge within context of infrastructural neglect, and that pose mothering as a form of infrastructural bridge-making labor for communities, in the words of Audre Lorde, who were never meant to survive, but survive nonetheless. I foreground the ways in which these accounts of mothering bridge feminist of color and disability politics, therefore enacting the, quote, progressive transformative coalition work theorized by Cohen. Finally, I conclude by mapping the implications for critical disability, ethnic American, and feminist of color studies by elaborating upon crip of color critique, an analytic genealogically linked to women of color feminisms and queer of color critique, and that further advances a disability studies to which race and class have become central. In the essay Queering the Crip, or Cripping the Queer, disability scholar Carrie Sandal defines the practice of cripping as the, quote, spinning of mainstream representations or practices to reveal able-bodied assumptions and exclusionary effects. In Cripping the Welfare Queen, I highlight the ways in which anti-welfare rhetoric relies upon disability to devalue poor Black mothers and to communicate with efficiency racialized mothering as a national menace. So along the rhetorical mainstays of anti-Blackness and misogyny, the language of disability, pathology, and disease wrote the welfare queen into public legibility. As Sanford F. Schramm observes, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act contributed considerably to the, quote, medicalization of welfare, as the act, quote, helped accelerate the tendency to construct welfare dependency as an illness, thereby transforming welfare reform into a set of therapeutic interventions designed to cure people of the malady. In other words, the dominant ideology of welfare dependency framed the need for public assistance as itself a disability, one that is then subject to state management and cure. Further, as both Linda Singer and Alexis Pauline Gumbs have observed, the Reagan-era discourse around racialized reproduction frames Black teenage motherhood as also a disease, an epidemic that justified the, quote, wars on poverty and drugs that combine to situate disease and enmity in the bodies of poor women. The Black mother as disease, Gumbs argued, quote, posed a threat on privileged populations through tax burdens, crime, and the general erosion of quality of reproduction that moved from oppressed sites to privileged ones. Represented as both epidemic and threat then, the narrative of racialized reproduction positioned poor Black mothers as disabling to the nation writ large. This particular line of logic demonstrates how disability, rather than signaling a lack of utility, rendered poor Black women particularly useful to the expansion of global capitalism, which is contingent in part upon resource privatization. In her reading of Hortense Spiller's Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American grammar book, Nirmala Aravelis forges a similar relationship between Blackness and disability. While, as Aravelis writes, the dominant paradigm has conceived of disabled bodies as having very little economic value, except in the very limited context where their extraordinariness was made hyper-visible, in Mama's Baby, Papa's Baby, it is in, quote, becoming disabled that the Black body is at the height of its profitability. For Aravelis, the scenes of actual mutilation, dismemberment, and exile enacted in the Middle Passage rendered the Black body a commodity through acts of purposeful disablement. And because Spiller's essay theorizes the undoing of gender, family, and motherhood through the slandered body of the Black mother, its insights centrally engage the welfare mother and the social function she serves. It is through the cover story of welfare mother as both unfit mother and unfit worker, the conjoining of Blackness and disability, that Black women then became most useful to capitalism. That is, in becoming disabled through the pejorative language of idleness, dependency, and disease, the welfare mother as mythical figure enabled the uneven distribution of resources to continue unabated. As the origin story for resource privatization, the welfare queen thus operates as perhaps the definitive disability narrative of late capitalism, a cautionary tale of state dependency that enabled the reallocation of public resources toward elite interests. To further elaborate the welfare queen's utility to a crip of color critique, I will now turn to Sapphire's